Hey everyone, it's Chad,
Khalil.
and we are the Marshals of the Truth. All right, to continue on which is now our fourth part of our series on peace versus freedom. We're going to continue and finish up what we were talking about of the philosopher Hegel and his views about freedom and what that really means for society. So in our last episode, we finished out by describing his points of view on the problem that complete freedom has when it comes to just the overall peace and the overall structure of society. He detailed that everyone through their minds and through their actions have like they have an element of complete and absolute freedom. And of course, that all sounds fine. You could go do whatever you want, you could move however you want, but that comes into conflict when there are other people, because other people have those same points, have not the same points of view. They have different points of view, different ways they view the world, different ways that they want the world to be. And so when you have your point of view, which usually you would go to keep, that you would think that it is the view of the world, when you have yours and that conflicts with someone else's, if you want yours to be correct, you need to convince them or you need to get them to surrender their point of view. That means it would have to come through some sort of conflict, what he called a constant battle of wills, in which you would need to dominate against the other point of view, against the other person, in order to make it clear to them that your point of the view of the world is the correct one. And so here you get the problem of absolute freedom. If you have this freedom, there are other people who believe that with their freedom of mind, they can do or feel or act however they want because that's how they see the world. With that absolute freedom, all you get is the chaos and violence of continuous conflict and continuous disorder. Um, However, in his quote talking about the absolute freedom of mind, I wanted to highlight, what that really means. And Hegel would go on to describe what that is in his book, I believe the Phenomenology of Spirit. I believe that was the book. And he described that um, the mind is not passive. Thought does not simply register what is happening in the world. The mind is essentially free, and both thought and action spring from the imaginative freedom that is the essence of mind. This was um, kind of a description of what Hegel was talking about in his book, The Phenomenology of Spirit, in the book On Politics by Alan Ryan, which of course we like to really reference in the series. But what you have described there is that through knowing in its own way, the mind is free to interpret the world however much it wants to do. And so, with your mind, you have the freedom to do whatever you want. You could do great things with the powers of our mind. We could create societies, make whole new crazy cool technologies, solve world hunger. We could create computers like you're watching us now. We could do these great things with our minds. However, we could also do terrible things with our minds because of that absolute freedom. We could create bombs, we could kill other people, torture things, animals, bring not just animals but people into slavery. All of this, of course, at the end of the day, comes to the freedom that's still in because of our minds. And so, with this complete freedom, it has the possibility to end us all. I mean, what we talked about in one of our past series with it was the idea of nuclear deterrence, nuclear weapons. That's all things that we created with the freedom that we have with our mind. With that absolute freedom, if we were to use it to the fullest extent, we could end all life in humanity. So that complete freedom that we have, it can do great things, but it can also do very, very, very terrible things. So to a certain extent, and I'll let Khalil you continue on this, we actually kind of want some sort of order to the world around us. We kind of don't really want all this freedom, do we?
We don't. We don't just need order, we want it. Because as I was describing with Hegel, is that the competition of wills that he's referring to, this idea, this it's what he called it, the world and where there is no more order, where there's no more government, and everyone is left by themselves in some sort of like modern day communist society, where there's no authority, whatever. He called that the competition of wills, and called it that because everyone is going to be fighting each other. Everyone's going to be fighting for some resource they need, and we can list and we'll eventually list off all the things that we will be fighting for in such a world, whether it be medical treatment, food, um, other things that just generally keep us alive, the right to be alive, in a society that has no order, no government. In that case, it's barely even a society. Um, that is what a competition of wills means. And the fact that everyone starts fighting each other in such a world means that inherently in the mind of each person that's fighting every other person, they want to dominate the other person because they want their will to win out. And they want their will to win out because they don't want there to be other opinions. And they don't want other opinions because they know that that's going to create disorder in society. They'd rather have one point of view, one truth, and that is going to create order. Complete freedom is the suggestion that truth is what we make it. And the fact that each person fights each other in such a communist, anarchist sort of society, means that we don't really want to fight everyone, like we know that in a society that has no order, that's going to be the only choice we have, to fight everyone to survive. We have that inherent um, instinct to survive in an extreme scenario. We don't just choose to die out, and that's the part of us that's an animal that helps us in such a terrible extreme situation, is that we do whatever we can to survive. And so, in such a crazy, non-order sort of society, that complete freedom that we have, it's inside our mind. We don't want to fight. That's why we fight everyone else, so we can create peace again.
Exactly. I kind of sum it up in this way, that the presence of other people makes the idea of ultimate freedom impossible, because there are others who stand in the way of making the world ours. That's why it will never work. You have your idea, you have your way that you want the world to be. You got 8 other billion people who view it a different way, and y'all are not going to agree. So the only way that you make sure that yours is right is to fight, is to survive, is to dominate. And we as humans do not want to be living our entire lives fighting, killing, arguing over every single point of view, because there's like infinite points of views on everything. We don't want to spend our entire lives fighting when we want at a certain, I mean, it's not even a hard thing to say that we want to be living in peace. We want to be living in our houses with our families, raising kids or something like that, or doing the things that we enjoy, um, or helping other people. We don't want to just be fighting everyone all of the time. That sucks. It's chaos, it's disorder. So we want peace, we want order. And so the whole idea of just having an absolute freedom is somewhat absurd, and fighting to free yourselves from the shackle of any sort of order doesn't make sense, because what you're just going to be left with is a constant fight in which only the strongest will survive. Um, and so here we get into, again, with the progression of how civilization has been going, is this debate of, we agree that we want peace, we want order in our societies. We don't want to be fighting other countries, we don't want to get bombed, pillaged, taken over. But at the same time, we still do want a little things, given back to us. We want some payment or some services or some things that we have or some things that we want given to us by this government, who we give our, at the very least, our loyalty and belief in, that we give all these things to the government. We want a little things back. And maybe that means we want a little more freedom. While it might not, while it might not mean that we want that all that absolute freedom back, we want some semblance of it. We want the freedom to be ourselves, the freedom to not be persecuted, the freedom to not pay an obscene amount of taxes. And so when we get to the 19th, the 20th, the 21st centuries, we have societies advancing for, um, you know, we moved again from the rejection of kings through the abolishment of kings in Western societies, but also to the rejection of kings in new societies. With the American Revolution, we decided that we did not want an overbearing monarch to be ruling over our entire country. We wanted a president who could be removed and govern with the trust of the people, who would, of course, give that to him. And so we had with the United States, with France, with the French revolutions, and Britain, well, not exactly Britain, but other countries in which they didn't want a king anymore. So we moved on from that idea of complete order to a government that would give us some things back for what we wanted. Um, and then going forward from that, we wanted again some more freedoms. We wanted what we would call civil rights. We wanted, like I described again, freedom from being persecuted, freedom to express our religion how we see fit, to express our customs, our cultures, our languages, our political beliefs without getting shot in the street. Um, and then we continued again with that towards more benefits being given back to us by these governments. Some of the more, I guess, modern ones that we get is universal suffrage, everyone being able to vote. And then ones going further than that, such as universal health care, in that the government would be giving everyone in the state some semblance of health services that they could have, for a basic necessity. And so what you get again is the progression of civilization from not just wanting complete order in their societies, but to be also given back a little bit of some semblance of freedom, some benefits, some privileges, some ways that can make their life better, while the government also protects them and gives them some sense of order within their societies.
Yeah, so these are all examples about how, as time has gone on, there was attempts at balance. There was attempts at balance between peace and freedom, because as much as order and chaos is so crazy to think about, we don't think about order and chaos when we think about society. We think about we and we just think of it as being so crazy. The idea of order and chaos, it delegitimizes both sides, because we know how crazy it is to have complete order, but then we also know that we don't want chaos. So it's really easy to separate that from our daily lives. But with peace and freedom, those are both things we want. We don't want order necessarily, like we
We don't
well,
want too much order.
that's the thing. When you think of order, you think of it as something that you don't want. And when you think of chaos, you also think of it as something you don't want. But to create the best theoretical balance for which we can frame the best possible society, we need to balance it against two things that we both want. Because we don't want to balance between two things we don't want, like too much order, too much chaos. It needs to sound like something that we both actually do want to balance between, like peace and freedom. So before each one of these societies, at the very least in the Western world, and then in the East, this also began to follow as well in its own cultural format. Um, the like just to expand a little bit, because there were just a couple interesting ideas I was thinking about with the idea of complete peace, which I don't imagine we'll be giving up on anytime soon in this series, is that knowing is an act of freedom, and all people are free. Ideally in a um in a society that best balances peace and freedom. So all the greatest achievements of humanity in this case would be available because of freedom. But knowing as an act of freedom is only possible in a society with some amount of order. Because without order, knowing is not necessary. We would have been returned to animals. An animal doesn't need to know. An animal doesn't need to know what the truth is. Like our ability to know and philosophize and create the best society, is only available because of that certain amount of order that reigns in our animalistic tendencies. We hope to rise beyond it, and that's what I hope that we've done. So, um, I don't know. I just like before we go to examples of complete peace in modern society, there were just a couple of quotes that like we didn't get to mention up until this point, but I just thought they were so cool that I thought you guys would want to hear it. There's this movie that I like to watch about Alexander the Great. Um, it's about 20 years old at this point. It's about as old as either one of us. And I'm not sure if everything in it is historically accurate, but there is this way of viewing. There was this dialogue between Alexander and his mother, who encouraged him to be as great as possible. Um, he told him that he was divine. And there was something that she told him once in the movie. She said, "The gods favor you, great wealth, power, conquest. All you desire, the world is yours. Take it." So I'm not even sure if it's particularly relevant to exactly what we're talking about at this moment in the episode, but soon at some point in this series it will be. Um, the idea that the world is one person's. Take it, you know,
Mhm.
is an
This,
example of complete peace, you know, but it's also the work of such a head of state, of such a person that the world is theirs to also like create stability, um, as well as freedom for the other people around them so that it has a certain sense of vitality. Societies with complete peace, as we're about to mention, do not last. Not really. And examples of complete freedom also don't last. So where's the staying power? I don't know. I just thought you guys would really like that quote, and we'll analyze it some point later on in the series when it becomes more relevant.
yeah. It was interesting, just as a quick note, when you mentioned that quote, I see it more as an emphasis of complete freedom, in that with the mind you have the ability to view the world as completely yours. It's your point of view. It's yours for the taking. And again, as we said, if there was no one else on the planet, that seems like a great idea. But since there are other people who don't agree with you, you got to make sure that your point of view, they don't just understand it, they submit to it. And so that's what again comes with complete freedom, as we described earlier. It's chaos, a constant battle of the wills, in which your point of view has to be the point of view. It definitely was an interesting quote, and I'm sure we will find a place to kind of bring it up again, um, like as we go a little deeper in the series. But with that, as we kind of describe the progression of civilizations from complete disorder to the desire for complete order, and then now trying to find some place in the middle in which we could have both ideas of peace and freedom. Through that progression, we've been able to see and examine some examples of where they've rejected that balance and have tried to go completely one way or the other. And for all these examples, they almost all fall. They never last. They're not places that you could go and try to see today because they've either withered away or have gone so far from the original values that they're not even recognizable as those first ones. Um, and so one example that we get of a side trying to go completely one way is a side that sought to have complete peace. Um, a great example that we found was Imperial Japan. So Japan in the 1920s um, sought to, when it was trying to nationalize and become greater of a power in the Asian realm, it sought to Well, it created a law in 1925 called the Peace Preservation Law. And what it essentially did was crush any possibility that points of views that went against the way that the Japanese government was formed, the way that it operated, the way the economy operated, anything like that. It's crushed any possibility of those ideas being held by any people, or they would be imprisoned. Article 1 of this peace preservation law wrote as anyone who forms or knowingly participates in groups whose goal is to deny the system of private property or to change our national essence shall be sentenced to prison or penal servitude up to 10 years. Anyone who attempts to commit the crime will also be punished. So, what you have here is the rejection of the freedom of ideas, which again is something that we just talked about, that we have a freedom within our minds to do or believe any sort of thing or idea, or create any idea that we have. And what we have here is a society stopping you from even, you can have these opinions, but if you express them in any single way that goes against the current system of the Japanese government, you were to be in prison. And even if you tried to do it but didn't do it, go to jail. To describe, just to like clarify, when it said the system of private property, how that's commonly explained as is essentially, capitalism. The system in which people can own things for themselves. It's not all owned by the state. And this is, of course, in contrast to communism, in which there's no private property. And then the national essence as basically, I kind of see it as the status quo, the way that Japan's beliefs are, the way that their belief of wanting to take over or expand their nation for material or just ideological gains. You try to change that, you go to jail. And so you have here is an attempt to enforce complete peace in contrast to the freedom, in this case, of just ideals within a society.
Right, because if socialism, communism, republicanism, and democracy, which this law was meant to crush in its entirety, um, and this was supposed to be, as most laws are, a permanent agreement, that this is going to be the way in how Japan was to be run forever. If Japan were to win World War II, then this would be, ideally in their minds as the way in how Japan would be run forever. And this meant, because if socialism, communism, republicanism, and democracy are such threats to the Japanese imperial government at the time, then it it meant that even an attempt at showing socialism, communism, republicanism and democracy, would be obviously you would be punished for this, but since looking at the name of the law, peace preservation law, it's in the name. They want they want peace and they want to preserve that peace ideally forever. And if even suggesting each one of these ideas in the smallest way possible is a danger to the peace, is somehow going to damage or destroy the national essence, then it is very clearly an example of totalitarianism, because in a totalitarian society and where peace must be preserved forever and where the national essence is so fragile, you cannot even in the smallest way go against the government. I can't even imagine exactly just how small of an offense must be for you to go to jail, penal servitude for 10 years, or even be executed once World War II started.
Exactly. Any sort of belief or any sort of exercise in the freedom to believe or express your political ideas, if that was even the case, you express anything that goes against that system, the current system of Japan in this case, you were to be removed from society. What you have here is kind of the goal here to preserve a full and a complete peace within their societies. And really the only way to do that is to ensure that no one works against that peace, and that the only way to do that is really to get rid of freedom altogether. It's easy to, it sounds like it was something that you could do by just putting people in prison and making sure that they couldn't exercise any of that. But in reality, if you put someone in prison, they could still believe all the, the views that they want to believe. They just can't do anything about it. Their beliefs in, say, socialism, communism, republicanism, democracy, those aren't going to go away. You just don't see them. And so, really, at the end of the day, the only way that you get to remove this threat, really, of freedom is to make people surrender it willingly, to convince them that those old beliefs that they held were wrong, and that the beliefs now, the system now is correct. You have to make them, you can't really just have to make them. They must give up that belief. They must give up that freedom in order to really secure what a peace would see, what a state would see as complete peace. Um, Sometimes what you have is the belief that what you could do is just kind of brainwash people into believing your point of view. You show them a screen saying that America's the best 20 billion times, and maybe they'll say it just as well as they'll say it like they believe it. They might not completely do it, but sometimes they will. And what that does is that comes from a choice. That comes from a choice that that person made to give up whatever that belief is and submit to that next one. And in order for that belief to really be gone, they must relieve themselves of that freedom completely. And in and of itself, as I said, that's an act of freedom. And so I see it, how I see it is the last act of freedom is to give it up. The last way that you lose that idea is to forfeit it, to surrender, to give in to the captor in their belief system. And in that self, that's a free choice. You could choose not to and just act like you do, but then you're not really going with the program, and probably the captor will see it. But in only to really truly surrender some sort of belief, you have to give up that, you have to give it up. And that's a choice, that's a free choice. And so it seems kind of paradoxical, but it really is true that the last act of someone's freedom is to give up that freedom.
Yeah, that's why such totalitarian societies are interesting because it's almost as if the law itself wasn't meant to preserve the peace. It was to create the means of which someone would eventually give up their freedom to maintain the peace. It was a means to an end. It was not the end itself. The law wasn't going to preserve the peace. It was going to make I was going to make freedom such a terrible thing to have that they would give it up, fall in line, and then reframe their brain. Because this is actually interesting. It lines up with Hegel very well. This secretly, the Japanese probably did not know this when they were framing this law, but it lines up with Hegel's idea of the strength of the mind, because the mind is able to trick itself into thinking that because it's aligning with the government, because it's preserving peace, that it actually is choosing to not be free anymore, and therefore it's still free. It's still free, even though it's doing everything the government wants. It's maintaining the peace. Freedom is too terrible to have, but technically, you chose to do it, so you used your freedom to do it. If you can reframe your mind into believing that you're free, then even when you're completely not free, then it just goes to show how strong the human mind is. The last act of freedom is to give it up, but even once you've given it up, you can still reframe your mind in such a way that you believe you're free, even when in reality world, you're certainly not.
Yep. And as we start to get to our time, I have a last quote to really just hammer in this point, in that the really only way to win your idea, to really win, is to get that other person to submit. If you just try to force it, they won't believe it. And so again, this is from On Politics, And it's again a summary of what Hegel was saying in regards to freedom and the importance or the necessity of having to force your beliefs and force the others to submit. And so here we have here, it's describing, I'll just read it out. Paradoxically, the slave gains an unobvious victory over the master. The master gains the obvious victory. The slave must acknowledge that the master's superiority and accept that he is indeed his lord and master. The master cannot have what he wants from slavery. He seeks recognition, but a slave's recognition is tainted. Being extorted, it is not recognition at all. One might as well recite one's virtues to a recording device and play it back. The slave's acknowledgement of the master's superiority isn't worth having just because it is a slave's recognition. It's from page 661. And to kind of end this out, this hammers home the point that just kind of servitude or trying to brainwash a civilization or trying to criminalize a belief won't destroy that belief. They could just go along with it, acting like they believe it, or say that they really believe it and just kind of know that the only reason they do that is because of fear, because of hate, because of extortion, or yeah, you're not going to get that if you just force a belief. If you're a slave, you're still going to believe in freedom, and but you'll just know that you can't have it now because the master is there. Um, and so yeah, with that, in our next episode, we're going to continue on this idea, and then also get to the idea more examples of societies seeking complete peace and seeing how well or how bad they work, because at the end of the day, they all fall in one way or the other. Anything else to add? All
No,
right.
no, yeah.
Yeah. With that, we are the Marshals of the Truth. We'll see you in the next episode.